I hope to share some, I think, relevant information to help you to join and start conversations about your scholarship and advance work in the discipline of counseling in particular. So today, I believe I have my journal editor hat on and would like to share with you 10 most common mistakes. And I think that'll help you a lot. I see lots of mistakes from the submissions that come in to the journal. And just to give you an idea, I work with 4 associate editors who are also amazing scholars in the area of multicultural counseling. I also hire 3 editorial assistants who are all doctoral students, none of them at Xavier, by the way. And we also have 6 emerging reviewers, and these are advanced doctoral students who are about to defend an early career counselor educators, whom we are grooming for leadership in the area of journal publishing. And so the editors serve as mentors to the emerging reviewers, and they review papers with us. They help us to develop editor commentaries at the beginning of any issue to pull the themes of the papers together for our readership. And they work on other kinds of projects. Our editorial review board consists of 20 scholars who already have a history of scholarship and can conduct reviews for us. And then we have a consulting elders board that's about, let's say, 10 to 15 people. And they are senior scholars who are either retired or very advanced in their careers, have probably been journal editors and so on. And they serve as advisors. They also do ad hoc reviews on occasion, and they provide support to emerging authors. So with that, I want to just jump right into this because I want to be able to answer your questions, because I think that's where I can be most helpful. So I'm going to go through these 10 common mistakes. And I decided, I was thinking about, should I frame it or not? And I decided, no, I'm just going to jump right into it so that we can get right to the discussion. Oops. So the learning outcomes, I hope to increase your awareness of predispositions that you have, because I find that authors have feelings about submitting, and I'll talk a little bit about that. To increase your knowledge, of course, I talked about that, but also to help you to become an advocate for yourself, and to know when to continue discussing possible edits and when to fold and say, yes, I'll just go ahead with the suggested edits, or no, I want to pull my paper. So we'll talk about that. So here's number 1. This is the number 1 thing. It's the biggest issue. It drives me nuts, okay? Fail to read the journal submission guidelines. So a lot of times people have great papers, but they don't match the focus of the journal, not just my journal. This is also for other journals as well. Before you submit, don't just go by the name of the journal or a journal that you think you'd like to be in because it's prominent or it's prestigious. Instead, think about, what are you talking about? And does it relate to the mission of the journal? So it's important to read the guidelines to see. A common mistake, not with JMCD, but with another journal that I know about, is the journal did not accept empirical research articles. They only accepted conceptual papers. And one of the things that the editors used to complain about all the time is the plethora of empirical manuscripts that they would receive. So that's just a case of people not reading the submission guidelines. So that's one. Why does that happen? I think, again, about these dispositions that we have in submitting. I think sometimes that we're so anxious about the process, particularly if we're new, that we're not thinking, like we're not getting oxygen to the brain to think about all the things that we need to do. So sometimes that can prevent us from just going through methodically, step by step, of how do you submit. Another one is the word or character count. And so a lot of times people don't adhere to our character count for JMCD, and that's annoying. And it's also frustrating for authors because they might submit something that is twice the size of a manuscript that we accept. And then when we say cut it down, they're like, well, I can't get my ideas into a smaller a word count. And they're really angry and annoyed and irritated when we do that. So I try to, and also the editorial assistant who's responsible for going through the checklist for submitted manuscripts, we try to catch that early on to let people know as soon as they submit, you're way over our character count. Now, people also say, you know, hey, intellectually, this is important. I really can't, I must, you know, say this in X number of words or characters, and it just can't be done. The problem is that we only have so many pages for a print journal, and the cost of going over our page count, our page limitation is exorbitant. So we can't afford to go over our page limitations for the print journal. And so if we let someone go way over the character count for their paper, it means another paper won't get published. So in other words, if we, on the average, publish 4 papers per issue, and we allow someone to be grossly over, that means we'll only be able to publish 3. And so that means that people who have accepted papers have to wait even longer to get that paper in publication. So it's a disservice to your peers and your colleagues to do that. Besides the fact that, yeah, you can say it, and people do say it within the character count. So try to meet the submission guidelines. I mentioned the focus of the journal and its readership and the types of submissions considered. So it's really important for you to first read through that, annotated, make notes, and then compare it to what it is that you're trying to submit to see, is this what they're looking for? Is it just not the right journal? Even though it could be a great paper, great idea, well written, just isn't the focus of the journal. Number 2, fail to proof the manuscript. And I know you're thinking, really? But yes, people submit papers that are still in markup, that have strike-throughs and comments and all kinds of stuff. And it's like, why? So before you hit submit, take a look at your manuscript and make sure it's a clean copy. And sometimes, just to be sure, maybe you should email it to yourself because maybe you can't see those things in your copy. Send it to a co-author and make sure that it's in good condition. That's very annoying. Reviewers don't like that. So a lot of times I'll forward the manuscript for review, and the associate editor or the reviewers will kick it back to me and say, I can't read this. This is annoying. There's just too many markups in here. I can't read it. Another is grammar. And you'd be surprised once again, why is that happening? I'd say when you finish your manuscript, have someone to read it and proof it, go through it. If you know someone who is an English major or someone you know who's an English professor or whatever, have them to read it and go through it and do the grammatical corrections. Again, for reviewers who are reading mostly for content, it's annoying when they're distracted by APA and grammar guidelines. Now, APA manual guidelines, as you know, we've switched to the new 7th edition. As of August 1st, we will hold authors accountable for the new guidelines. So you need to get a hold of the new APA guidelines and study up on that and submit, because certainly if you submit to our journal or another, they're likely to suggest that you need to switch over. Typographical, oh, okay, missing citations. Again, with so many people reading it. So for us, there are at least 5 reads. So the editorial assistant is reading a manuscript to make sure that it meets the submission guidelines. I read it as editor-in-chief when it gets to me to see if it's a good fit for the journal. So that's a light read to make sure that it's a good fit and that it's not just out and out insufficient. And we do get those sometimes where someone will submit like a 7-page paper that's not going to sufficiently present your thesis. So yeah, that could get rejected without review. So I provide the second, a cursory review. It then goes to the associate editor, who provides the 3rd review, and then based on that, decides on which reviewers are going to provide the blind review. At least 2 reviewers, so that's 4, 5 people who reviewed it already. And then once they review it, it goes back to the associate editor, who makes a recommendation for decision. And then I do that final hard read. So that's when I stop, get some tea or a glass of wine, and I sit down and I do a very careful read because I take my disposition letter very seriously. And I may even add to suggestions that the reviewers have made. So that's at least 6 reads. And so, yeah, if you have missing citations, it's going to be caught. And again, it's annoying and it's distracting from the review process. Sometimes people submit manuscripts that are not blinded. In other words, I can see the name of the author where the authors are citing themselves in the manuscript, or they leave it on a title page, which they shouldn't do for a blind review. Sometimes people send the wrong version. In other words, we're making comments about the version that's been submitted. And then after we've completely done the review and provided maybe a revised resubmit, the authors come back and say, oh, I'm sorry, I sent you the wrong version. We had actually cleared up some of those issues with our final version that I forgot to send to you. Again, that is just so, I don't know, discourteous to the reviewers who are doing this free and voluntarily to service the profession. So that's pretty bad. So yeah, fail to proof the manuscript to make sure that it is indeed in good quality and it is the manuscript that you want to send. Third, this is one where maybe some journals don't care about that. We do at JMCD. And one of the reasons that I feel so strongly about that is because I've had the opportunity to serve on review panels with the National Science Foundation, having received some NSF grants. And I like to follow their guidelines because they, I think, have higher standards. And so I think that the counseling profession should have higher standards for our scholarship. And so I like to use the NSF guidelines as a model. And they won't accept a grant proposal unless it has a theoretical framework. And so I'm a stickler for that. So I typically am looking at a paper to ask, how does your theory aid in looking at the problem differently? So if other people have looked at this particular problem and they perhaps did not use relational cultural theory to incorporate an understanding of relationship, or looking at it from critical race theory to talk about the overarching impact of racism and structural racism on whatever the issue is or whatever. So how does the theory itself aid in looking at the problem differently? How does the theory help to explain the findings of the study? So on the back end, when you're looking at theory and now you have results or findings, go back to your theory and talk about how the theory helps to inform and explain the findings in your paper. How does your theory align with the methodology and the methodological protocols? That's one that people miss a lot. So when I'm reading through and looking at the methods, I'm asking, okay, does the theory align with that? Do those two things go together? The methodology, meaning what particular methodological framework have you chosen, and how does that relate to the theory that you've chosen, so that everything is all in alignment, it makes sense. And that's one of the things that reviewers will catch authors on when they don't align the design together very well. If you submit a conceptual paper, and I can tell you, just me as editor, I don't like conceptual papers. And the reason is because they're typically not done well. Often they're just reviews of the literature, prior research, and that's not sufficient for a conceptual paper. So they're just not done well. So I tend to focus on empirical papers, qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, whatever, but just not conceptual. However, sometimes authors do a great job of presenting something that proposes widespread change for the profession. And when they come up with something so new and so innovative about how we think about something and frame it in such a way that everyone in all the subspecialties and everything, that it would apply to us, then I think that belongs in the journal. And for JMCD, of course, it would be related to multicultural counseling. So yeah, so use of theory is really important, and I don't want you to make that mistake. How did I go from 3 to 5? That's weird. So 5. Luckily, I gave you an extra, so I still have 10. Sorry about that. Insufficient presentation of intellectual merit of the thesis. So someone once said that when you're developing your research, you should answer the questions of what, so what, and then what, as a way to just sort of have an elevator speech about what's research. So what is the phenomenon under investigation? So what, now that you've presented something new, your findings or whatever, what does it mean, any intellectual merit? And then what is, okay, so what do we do with this information? So what, then what? With that, it's important to do a good job in reviewing extant research addressing the phenomenon under discussion. And I know for many of us, we learned how to do this during our doctoral studies, if not before. But the problem is that often it's not in relation to the journal. So for JMCD, since we focus on multicultural counseling constructs, that the extant research in the lit review should be an understanding of what we've said in multicultural counseling about this particular phenomenon. So a lot of times people will talk about disability issues, but don't frame it within counseling. So it becomes very difficult to talk about that. Or they may talk about issues related to personality or self-esteem or whatever, and they don't cite multicultural counseling literature. So they don't bring it into the purview into our line of vision. So that's always an issue. It's important when you review the literature to talk about what the limitations are of prior research, and then present your approach, your research as an alternative solution to the phenomenon. So just walking through those three things of what's been done, what's limited, or what doesn't work from that particular perspective, or why it doesn't address the phenomenon under investigation, and then what you're doing differently to have different outcomes. So we'll be looking for that. Lack of intellectual power. What that means is that people write, but it doesn't have a punch. It's not enough. Some of that could be, maybe you replicated work that's already out there. So we read it and go, okay, well done, but what's new about what you did? It's not new. So it's not news. And so we're not going to publish it. So that's one. Another is just not thinking about exciting the reader. So a lot of times the work itself is just blasé. And we try to work with authors by giving them suggestions about how they can improve that. But sometimes even after revisions, it doesn't work. So we ask them, hey, maybe this isn't a good fit. Number 7, poor methodological protocols. You'd be surprised, and I get a little annoyed because I think for some of these are they're dissertation research papers, and they have flaws in them. So that's awkward to try to provide feedback when we know that they've gotten help, but it's still not sufficient. So again, get someone, maybe a methodology professor, rather than someone who's in counselor education, and ask them what they read through it and provide you with feedback on it. For conceptual papers, just a review of literature, nothing new, and no new grand idea. And that's what a conceptual paper is for publication. It presents some grand idea for the profession that tells us we need to change direction in the way in which we look at something. And a lot of times the conceptual papers are not that. 9, as I said, the intellectual merit is often presented in talking about the purpose of the paper. And so that's well stated, but not in the discussion section when the authors are talking about the findings. And a lot of times in talking about how the findings extend, refute, or confirm prior research, that really isn't in there. So it's not clearly delineated, and it should be. So I would recommend that. Number 10, fail to include broader impacts. So this is something new that we're doing. It's something that I implemented this year. And it's a discussion of broader impacts. And the idea is not just to talk about what the recommendations are for practice. And that is pretty much what most of the authors do in their submitted manuscripts. They talk about how counselor educators would teach blah, 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 how practitioners would do blah, 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 blah. But they don't talk a lot about policy and how policy would change, and not just what KCREP or NBCC or even ACA or the divisions would do differently, but also public policy. So what would legislators do differently? So that's important to think about that. And then also to think outside the discipline, to think about how this work would be applicable to people in higher education, people in communities, people in faith-based communities or wherever, We need to broaden our view and be able to collaborate with and impact those areas outside of counseling. And so it's really important to be able to do that. And I told you, I skipped one, but I have a lagniappe. Lagniappe is a word that we use in New Orleans, and it means a little something extra. So I'm glad I did that, because otherwise you would have 9 instead of 10. So here's number 10. Advocate for yourself. Journal. The journal review process is discursive. So I always told my doc students that when I was at the University of Florida. Yay, Gators, oh Gators, right? I would tell them that you don't just submit a paper and then they mark it up and tell you all the things that were wrong with it. You receive it and then you hang your head in shame and never submit again. Now, I know that sounds silly, but a lot of people do that. So I don't want you to be that person. Understand that it's discursive. So if we say something to you, don't walk away. Say something back. Tell us what you thought about our recommendations. Think about it seriously. Sleep on it, maybe. And then come back to it and say, okay, if I did that, I really do think that would strengthen the paper. So I know myself, when I first started out and I used to get those harsh reviews, that at first I was really angry. I couldn't stand these people. I was like, who do they think they are? This was an amazing paper. But after I thought about it and I started going through and making the edits and then revised the manuscript, I would look at it and think, oh my God, they were so right. This is a better paper. And then I would write back to the editor and I would say, please thank the reviewers, because their suggestions did really strengthen the paper, and I do appreciate it. So it is discursive, so you write back. Also, there are times when I have said, no, I'm not going to do that, because that particular recommendation for a change changes what I'm trying to say. So I want to leave it in there, and I want to leave it just like that. And that really pushes the editor to make a decision, to agree with the author or agree with the reviewer. And sometimes we let it go. We say, okay, we'll leave it in. If you feel that strongly about it, we think it's okay. So learn to advocate for yourself, know when to fold and to when to keep asking or changing or keeping or whatever. Never be afraid of saying, I don't think it's a good fit, I withdraw my paper, and submit it to another journal. Really, don't keep going like that. You have the power. It's your work. Do what you want to do, and enjoy that. It's not the be all and end all of that. Also, if your paper is just out and out reviewed and rejected, it could just be the wrong journal. I know many times, again, in the beginning, that I submitted a paper, and at first I would, again, shrink away in shame. And then what I did was talk to an elder person who said, okay, while you're crying, resubmit the manuscript to another journal as is, and then go ahead and reread the reviews to see what they had to say, to see if you agree. But have it under review. Get it off your desk, get it off your computer, and always have something listed as under review. And that helped me with my dispositions, because it was difficult. It was difficult. So I have a couple of anecdotes for you. One is when I was first starting out and I was trying to get published, and it's like in the beginning, it's like trying to get that going on my own, and I remember talking with someone who is an eminent scholar, not in counseling, but eminent scholar, well published. And I was sitting on a bench outside of some presentation. And he's like, how you doing? And I was like, I'm feeling a little discouraged. And I talked about having just gotten a paper rejected. And he said, I have a binder with letters of rejection. And I just looked up at him. I was like, what, you? And he's like, yeah, every time I get one that's new, like it's a journal that hasn't rejected me before, I add it to my binder. And it's a reminder to me to stay humble, that every paper isn't for every journal. And so, you know, just don't get ahead of yourself. And that helped me to stay humble, that even the most productive scholars get rejected, even, you know, in the height of their career, they get rejected. So it could just be not a good fit. Just, you know, try another journal. Don't worry about it. So only you know what you're trying to say, and in the end, you are the expert. And so don't give up all your power to a journal, to the reviewers or the editor. So I think that's my 10. And now I'm ready to answer questions. And there's my contact information in case you want to contact me later. And I'm pretty active on social media, so you can follow me. It's cool. Right. So yes, questions.
I'll invite folks to jump in, and I'll hopefully kick this off. I suppose I'm wondering, particularly because revisions and reviewing is such a discursive process, how would you recommend communicating the responses to feedback or the responses to reviewers' comments back to the journal? I know there's some conversation between trying to write to the reviewer versus writing to the editor. If you could speak to that, like where the communication goes back to, that would be helpful. Yeah,
so the communication goes back to the editor. It doesn't go back to the review. I mean, it will eventually get to the reviewers, but the communication initially goes to the editor. So where the buck stops here, we're responsible. And so we're the ones who get the questions. And then we can get more information by reaching back to the associate editor or to the reviewers, but really we're responsible for what happens to the paper. What I recommend for authors is that they create a reviewing table, and it has 2 columns. On the left side, what you do is copy and paste every single review suggestion. Each one has a cell, and create headers. So you have like reviewer 1 and then all the cells for their recommendations, reviewer 2, all the cells, associate editor, all the cells. So you have a running table on the left side, the left column provides each and every discrete recommendation, including APA manual, grammar, each one is right. On the right side, you put what you did to respond to that singular recommendation. And then you say where it is. So it's like, here you said that we failed to mention intersectionality theory that relates to what. We inserted a paragraph, and it's on page 8, paragraph 2, line 1. Okay. You said that we had the citation in text, but not on the references pages. It has now been added, see page, whatever. So for each thing that they say, you have a cell on the same line and on the right column that says what you did and where it is. That helps a lot because people, it might be months before people, reviewers and editors get a chance to see your manuscript again. And for those of you who are doctoral students and working on your dissertation, you know the danger of not showing somebody what they said last time, because otherwise you wind up writing 4 and 5 dissertations because they say, yes, today, no, tomorrow, blah, 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 blah. So keep people honest because they forget. So put what they said they wanted you to do, and then what you did, and where it is. And in doing so, when you submit that with the letter, a cover letter that says, thank you so much for your revision, attached will find the revised manuscript, along with a review table and that outlines the changes that we made. And what that does, it allows the reviewers to go back to their section that they wrote that asked you to do X, Y, and Z. And then they look and say, okay, did they do it sufficiently? Yes or no. Now, at JMCD, it's rare for a paper to be accepted even after the first review. Typically, papers get what's called a R2 status. So original submission has an ID. The first revision is the same ID dot R1. The second revision is same ID dot R2. Some papers get to R4, but the average paper gets to R2. I don't know of any paper that's been accepted as an original submission. So some R1s, but the more frequent is R2s. So even when you use the review table and you point people to it, they will look at what you did and they might say, good job. Could you also add the following to that? And I think that will round out your paper. So you might submit, then submit a revision from an R&R, a revise and resubmit. And then the next one might be accepted pending or revised. It's not really accepted pending minor revisions, but it's minor revisions. So it's something very, very small. So you imagine you're about to get accepted if you do those minor things. So that's typically what happens: submission, revision, minor revisions, and accepted. So that's typically how a paper goes through it. So you'll submit a cover letter, and then I would say the revision table. With minor revisions, you don't need a revision table. Just say, I made those, and you can put it in the body of the cover letter to say, in submission is my second revision. The reviewers wanted me to do X, Y, Z. I've done it. Here it is. And that's good enough for those final revisions. If in fact they said, yeah, I don't think you understood what we were talking about, and you have to go through it again, do another revision table, and do it like that. But that's not a good sign if in the second submission you get a lot more things to say. It means that they're trying to work with you, but fundamentally there's some basic flaws in there. Let me also say that I don't know about other editors, but if we're going back and forth with authors about a paper, I'll say, enough of this. Let's just talk. So I've done that twice in 3 years, where I just said to the author, the corresponding author, let's have a Zoom conversation. What is it that you're not understanding? What is it that you're trying to say? Let me just help you to say what you're trying to say, so that we can go ahead and accept this paper and move it along, because we don't want to frustrate you. We don't want you to withdraw. Let's clarify. So again, that's part of that advocacy. There's always an option. There's always something if the journal is open. Does that, Gideon, does that help you? Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Let's see.
Open floor. Any questions, folks?
I'll jump in. I did have a question. First, I wanted to say I appreciate you sharing this knowledge with us. It was very thorough. So I feel like I learned a lot. So I appreciate it. I like your viewpoint about conceptual papers and how most of the time they're not as useful, and sometimes they're just kind of like a lit review that's redone. And when you talked about doing conceptual papers, but doing them like very thorough, or so that they're like kind of groundbreaking, I'm curious if you could share just a little bit more about potential ways of making them groundbreaking or how they could be different.
Yeah. Well, they're hard to do because it takes knowledge of a discipline. And typically, they're done well by people who've been writing about something for a long time. And so it really, I think the best ones are really senior people who've been writing or doing something. And they say, you know, I used to think blah, 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 but I don't think that anymore. I think that what we need to do is trash our discussion of da, 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 da. And we need to focus on this thing right here. So an example of that would be, just to make it up, right now we're having all this social unrest. And the discipline is grappling with the idea of what can we do in the discipline of counseling to create a more equitable environment, and where are we being harmful to any groups of members in the association or any student, you know, groups of students, groups of faculty, and so on. And what does it mean? This is the perfect time for someone to write a conceptual paper to say that we talk about multicultural counseling and about social justice, but now is the time to really say we need to be about anti-racist training. That is a change. That's huge. Whether people agree with it or not, it is a huge shift that someone would then chronicle the development of multicultural counseling and then contextualize it to talk about what changes need to be made and what the outcomes would be, even for end users, clients, if we change the way in which we taught or the content of what we taught or whatever. So that is what I mean by a conceptual paper coming with a big idea that changes everything, right? So that becomes important to think about conceptual papers as being big ideas. Does that help?
No, that's really, really helpful, because I'm thinking for the short time frame that we have on this collaborative, we might be doing conceptual pieces, and we do have experts that have tons of experience that have been doing it, so pushing to that next level of what hasn't been done. That's really good. Thank you.
Yeah, another big idea that's been floating around is as we bring in more people from different cultures and backgrounds into counseling, as we internationalize counseling and collaborate more with our sister organizations across the Atlantic and across the Pacific, that who knows, there could be another word for counseling that is more encompassing of what it is that we do that doesn't exist in English. So someone could propose, we need to change the name of the profession to some whatever word, and then outline what does that word mean and why it embraces more of what it is that we're trying to say and do. That's a big idea. It's more than the review of the literature. It takes the review and brings us to a new idea.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good point, because just even in the Mexican culture, the term counseling makes people off-putting or makes them not want to do it. But when you just say like something like pláticas, you're just having a conversation, it changes the way they see it. So I agree. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Dr. West-Olatunji, and I'm from New Orleans too.
Oh, I should have seen with your name.
Benoit, yeah.
Yeah.
At the University of Holy Cross. So,
oh, okay, yeah.
You mentioned about having to try to always have something under review, and choosing a journal that really fits your piece that you're submitting. Do you have any tips? Because I get overwhelmed with the number of journals. There's so many journals, and I have tried to look into and read the articles, read their submission guidelines and everything, but I find it a very overwhelming task to narrow down. So do you have any tips for choosing where to submit?
Yes. So what I would tell my doc students is start with a graduate journal. So whoever has a graduate student journal or a student journal in general, start with that. Often graduate student journals don't reject. They just work with people. They just keep revising until it's good. So it's a great place to start to learn how to do that. A second place is a statewide journal or a regional journal. They're going to get fewer submissions. They're going to have more practitioners, and they're more likely to, again, not reject and just work with you until it gets to be sufficient for publication. So the first one is a student journal. The second one is a state or regional journal. Okay, so for instance, in Louisiana, there's a LCA journal that is put out by Southeastern, I believe. So that's a possibility for you. And I remember doing that early in my career. So I published in there. So that's good. Those are great places to start. I don't recommend that doctoral students start with like JCD because it's just daunting. And the requirements are something that you probably want to lead up to, or JMCD for that matter. I would recommend that you start with one of the smaller journals where you get more support in being able to do that. Second, or third suggestion, partner with a faculty member who is productive. So somebody's already writing, and let them show you how to get it done. They can help you. Yeah. Fourth, the best way to think about the journal or the readership is to take a look at your references. So I used to say that to my doc students as well. It's like, well, who are you talking to on your own? Just who are you citing? So that tells you already who are the, what journals are you interested in? What audience are you in? That's who you want to talk to. So I tell them to just do a count. How many times did you cite CES or, school counselor or the Acervic Journal or whatever? How many times did you cite the various journals in your references? And that tells you who you're talking to just organically, right? It's rare that, so it doesn't, I never understand that, why someone would write a paper and have a lot of citations of other journals, and then they submit it to JMCD and they don't cite us at all. And I say that not because I want them to cite us, but it's like, but you weren't reading us, you weren't using us. Why do you want to talk to us now? It's like, I don't understand. You're not speaking our language, you're citing other disciplines. Why do you think we're interested? You're not talking to us. So I tell them, here are some articles that you could read that you might want to bring into this discussion. Or maybe you want to pick another journal. So I would say, as a fourth idea, just look at your references and see who you're citing, and that's who you want to talk to, and submit to them, because you're already in dialogue with them by virtue of the fact that you're citing them. It suggests that you're already in conversation with that readership.
Thank you.
That's a good start. So the student journals, the regional or state journals, partnering with a productive faculty member, and then just looking at the count of the citations of your paper to see who you're already talking to and submit there.
Those are very helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I have the unfortunate privilege of keeping track of time. And if we could close out, I guess I want to ask you, Dr. West-Olatunji, a lot of folks in this space are entering into like new writing mentoring relationships with different, I mean, as you know, different mentors and experienced scholars. Mm-hmm. Are there any tips you would have for the mentee side of things about how to take some of what you've shared today back into those relationships to get the most out of them? Is that a fair question?
Yep. That is a really good question. And it is about protecting our early career authors. Okay. So 1, manage expectations and speak up for yourself. Don't get nervous. There are some things you just have to ask. So one is when you're working on a manuscript, and I do this with my grant-funded research. When we get started, we're starting to do the work. We haven't collected any data. I say first order of business, let's talk about the order of our bylines, right? Before we even write papers. Here's the order. This is our agreement. We all agree to that. And everybody has to give me written agreement that we all agree to the byline, right? So typically what I say is the PIs are always first, and we decide if it's more than one PI, we decide, and we decide that order of how that's going to go. And so anything related to that grant-funded thing, you got the PIs going on, and then the order of involvement, and that's how we do it. But some people do it alphabetically. Some people are generous with, some people do this. It doesn't matter what, as long as you agree. So in starting on a research project with colleagues, with students, with peers, with a mentor, yep, early on, before you even write anything, it's like, so would I be first author? It's like, how's this gonna work? So get that question answered. I know it's scary, but you must, because the worst scenario is you write everything and then they put themselves first and you're angry about that. Don't do that. Answer that, discuss that first. So manage expectations about that, about the use, about the byline order. The second is manage expectations about what it is that you'll do, how much time that you'll spend, what other things might you be doing. So talk about those things. If that person is not only disseminating and writing, but they're also engaged in other things, do you want to be a part of those things? Yay or nay? It's like, if you do, ask those questions now. Say, oh, and if anything else comes up, like, an opportunity for us to present the paper, would you be interested in being a part of that? Where, tomorrow's the deadline for submitting to ACA Orlando. If you're working on a paper, do you want to submit that? Do you want to include your mentor on that, and so on? So I think it's important to manage expectations and also about what the outcomes will be of the relationship. Talk about that as well. I have a whole thing, like I'm really organized like that. I have a whole thing to protect doc students, graduate students with whom I work, where there's always accountability to me of what I said I would do for them and what the outcomes would be from our relationship. And there is a list of expectations for them of what it is that they need to be doing. And there's also weekly accountability of what's going on. So I typically ask that anyone I'm working with, that they create sort of an agenda for the next time we're gonna meet. And that comes to me the day before, because what it does is it gets my attention from all the other things I'm doing. When I get that agenda from them the night before, it's like, oh yeah, I'm going to meet with Gideon tomorrow. So this is what I said I would do. So I'm up late at night. Oh yeah, I said I would do that for him. So here it is, I got it. After the meeting, I generally type up notes to say, these are the notes from where we met. And we discussed this. We said the next meeting would encompass this. We would go to the next level with this. And there's an agreement that if the student doesn't say anything, I did an accurate representation of what we did. If I forgot something or I got it wrong, it's up to the student to say, hey, Dr. West-Olatunji, you forgot. We also said we were going to do such and such. I'm like, oh, thank you. Let me revise these notes. And that helps me to stay on track and sort of keep things dynamic and moving rather than us sitting and shooting the breeze every week or every other week. I can't stand that. As a student, I remember doing that and I hated it. So I want to see if I'm spending my time, it's valuable. Even as a student, it's valuable. And so I want that mentor to value my time as well. And it also values and privileges their time by keeping a record of what we did and what we're going to do next, what we did, what we're going to do next, and gets us to whatever we said the outcomes were of the relationship.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Any other final reflections, checkouts from anyone? Dr. West-Olatunji, on behalf of the collaborative, thank you for this. This has been amazing, and I think a particularly just like helpful way to, in some ways, judge our relationship with thinking about publication and submitting and revisions, because as you mentioned, it can be quite intimidating. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. With that, yeah. With that, we'll close out. I'll be around for a few more minutes if anyone needs to touch base. But thank you all for joining at this lunch hour or breakfast hour, wherever you are. I'll see you all at the next one. Thank you.
Thank you.